Good morning to everybody and welcome to the SMI Seminar Series. I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we meet today. On behalf of the Sustainable Minerals Institute, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. For those that don't know me, I'm Professor Neville Plint. I'm the Director of the Sustainable Minerals Institute here at the University of Queensland, and I'd like to welcome you to today's seminar. The seminar is titled The Biggest Sustainability Challenge Facing Mining: The Nature and Pace of Social and Environmental Performance Improvement. And this is delivered by Dr. Tony Hodge, an adjunct here at SMI. And Tony, it's so fantastic to have you online again. And we really look forward to having you in the Institute again for a session and a masterclass. And I mean, we really still talk about the time that you were here running that course. So we look forward to having you back. For those that don't know Tony, and I don't think there's many because you've very well known to many of us, you've had a career of 40 years in various roles in the private sector, in government, in quasi-judicial processes, civil society organisations, in communities, and with Indigenous peoples. And throughout Tony's career, he has explored both technical and social dimensions of achieving human and ecosystem well-being over the long term, and to finding solutions to difficult social, technical, environmental, financial challenges facing to today's society. He's written this lecture extensively and in applied sustainability, and was written and lectured, my apologies, Tony, I've got that wrong, extensively in applied sustainability, and was, of course, president of ICMM for 7 years until 2015. So, Tony, we're delighted to have you join us today. For those online, as normal, if you could please submit your questions in the Q&A button, not the chat button, in the Q&A button. And then at the end of the presentation, Tony, we'll take as many of those questions as time allows. What I'll do is I'll pick up the questions and I'll pass them on to you. And I'll try and group them together if they're not themes, and try and get through as many as possible. So Tony, over to you. And once again, thank you so much. And it's delightful to have you online and to see you again.
Yeah, well, thank you very much and for your kind words. I'm only sorry that I'm not there, because it's way more fun being face-to-face with folks. In any case, this is the question. Let me just make sure that I'm able to scroll down. Oops, there we go. This is the question that Neville put to me originally. What are the big sustainability challenges facing mining? And I reflected on that, and there are many sustainability challenges. And I wanted to zoom to the top of the mountain, because we don't get a chance to do that very often. So that's what I've done. But before I do that, I want to tell you about the foundation from where I am coming on this. There's a value set that underlines, and so folks that have been participated in my masterclass will recognize these things, that really what this invokes is a parallel care and respect for ecosystems and people, both, not one or the other, both equally. It's not a fight between the two. We need to care for both. And if that is the case, if we are going to achieve sustainability, the test is whether or not what we do, for example, in mining, contributes positively to both people and ecosystem over the long term. That's the foundation of ideas of sustainability. So if Nev's going to ask me what's the biggest sustainability challenges, this is where I start from, because that's the boundary condition of all of this. Ecosystem well-being and human well-being, they are the ends which we are trying to achieve. Everything a human society does, in a way, should be set out to achieve ecosystem and human well-being. And in doing that, that's the means we have to get to those ends. By the way, one of the issues we may sneak into is the fact that some people think of human activity as an end in itself, and economic activities as an end in themselves. In fact, they're just the means to achieve the ends of ecosystem and human well-being. And in order to get there, we have to think about not just what we do, but how we do it. So there is a process and a substantive dimension to this. We have to think not only on the immediate and short term, but also the long term. And in so doing, we have to recognize there's lots of unknowns. We have to think of continuously learning and adjusting what we do. Now, I put this middle diagram at the bottom on there just for you to reflect on as we move through this, because one of the challenges that we have is to capture and to integrate people's values, ethical principles, and engineering design objectives. And it's tough. It's not easy. And again, we may back into that as well a little bit farther on. Now, there's been lots of concern about mining going back decades. One of the little bits of piece of work that I was involved in came up with the realization that there's been lots and lots and lots of pressure for the mining to improve performance. But what are the main bits of that? So from within the industry, I'm aware of at least a dozen initiatives to improve things from a sustainability perspective. And from outside the industry, 36, at least 36, and there are more. This compilation, which came originally from some work of the Resolve Solutions Network in the World Economic Forum, slightly updated in 2018 in the paper that's referenced down there. But in the last 3 years would have been even further, could be even further grown here. Now, these next 4 slides I've put in here so I could share this with you. I'm not going to go through them. You can look at this after when the PowerPoint package is circulated. An initiative that would be useful would be to enrich and upgrade that compilation, because there has been tremendous pressure from a sustainable development perspective on the mining industry to improve. More recently, the financial services industry has come along and gained an interest in ESG performance, environment, social, and governance, much motivated by the increasing interest in society as their own investors say, well, what about this? And in fact, this is a broader reflection of the evolving values of society that grow in their interest and sensitivity towards the sustainability envelope. Unfortunately, and this is a somewhat dated World Bank cartoon, but unfortunately, there are still lots of examples of inability of companies to effectively interact with communities. You at SMI probably have a better handle on that than anyone in the world. And of course, more recently, the tragic tailings failures and very recently, the Juukan Gorge destruction there in Australia. So the fact is that from a sustainability perspective, the mining industry sort of goes along, tries to respond to concerns, and is upset because their relationship with society in a general way is still marked by a certain amount of distrust. In fact, in 2020, the World Economic Forum identified the trust deficit as the key risk facing the mining industry. If it's the key risk facing the mining industry, and I certainly think it is, then I'm going to zero in on that and say, well, what does that mean in terms of the biggest challenge to the mining industry? Before I do that, I want to recall to you, and this is not rocket science, that today there's a greater need for mine minerals than ever before. For these reasons, addressing poverty reduction, dealing with the inequality issue, nourishing the transition to the low carbon economy, and supporting the ongoing needs all across the world. In short, to make it possible for us to walk more lightly on the earth that is our home, that is what society is looking to do more and more. And again, that reflects an evolution of values which was not apparent 30, 40 years ago. I would argue that this society mining industry discordance is the biggest sustainability challenge facing mining. And the reason is this. if you want to see something done effectively and efficiently, it has to be done willingly. That applies to any relationship. In the case of mining and society, there's lots and lots and lots of stones being thrown. And quite frankly, on the extreme, people outside the industry still articulate the idea that mining companies are ogre who are simply there to rape and pillage and take the money and run and leave a mess behind. And similarly within, and at the same time within the mining community, that's what you get outside the mining community. Within the mining community, the sense is that the folks on the outside just don't understand, particularly the importance of mining to modern society. And if they would just stop asking and leave us alone to do what we're good at, all would be good. We have to bring that together. It's a relationship issue. I would argue that this is a management issue. It's a society mining management challenge. In mining operations, in any large corporate environment, you set out the desired results. You put in place a plan to achieve those results, those end results. And then you track your success along the way, adjusting your course if it's needed. So I would argue, if you're coming at this from a sustainability perspective, that the end results have to be human and ecosystem well-being, that we need to track our way forward to achieving that, and we need to assess our success, give ourselves credit when success is achieved, and adjust course when it's not achieved. It's a management challenge. And we somehow haven't managed to put that together at the highest level. I will also argue that we have to we have to pose and answer the right question. And for all of those of you who are deeply educated in engineering sciences, you know that it is the design question that is really the key thing to effective design, to effective engineering. In research, it is the research question that is the critical thing to effective research. And I would argue that we may not be asking the right question. The question we ask is oftentimes, what do those goddamn miners need to do better? And we need to, and we go ahead and offer solutions to that so that they can do what we want. My sense is that we need to think differently about this question, that we actually need to think about how can we understand and encourage the growth and adaptation of what I will call a mining industry culture. I think it's the culture that is holding us back. It is the culture of the mining industry that is underneath the continuing discordance between mining and society. And that's what we have to think about. Let me talk just about a bit about the mining industry. What is it? It's a very ancient, complex web. And for anybody that's studied change management, you will know that something that is ancient and has been around a long time is even more difficult to change directions than a new industry. And it's complex because, listen, on the formal side, I now know, and with other work that's in progress right now, that there are some 25,000 mining companies employing in the order of 2 to 3 million people. I don't know the exact number of employees, but it's in that order. But the number of companies is not tens, it's tens of thousands. In addition to the formal mining industry, there's the informal, what I will call the informal mining industry, the artisanal small-scale mining, which is involving many, many more people, probably in the order of 20 million, depending on 20 million people, depending on the price of what is being mined artisanally. It could go up and swing wildly. But importantly, there is a rich mix of interests in and around these companies. And they have a role to play in what is this thing I'm calling mining industry culture. there are investors and shareholders, subcontractors and suppliers. There's all the various services, financial, technical, legal, social. There are host communities, there are indigenous people, there are governments, local, state, provincial, national, etc. Organized labor, civil society organizations, international organizations, industry and professional associations, and there is academia, who you are part of. There are consumers, and there's the future generations. Now, these elements all influence the nature of the mining industry, the mining community culture. And if we're to change the direction of the mining community, we need to think about all of these people's roles, and we haven't been very good at that. Now, the industry itself is obviously very, very complex. This is an example because many of these different companies have different objectives and have a different scale of activity, have a different capacity to embrace change, and have a different receptivity to change. It's a complex thing. This is a classic, this outline of what happens in mining, the metallic minerals, the fuel minerals, the fertilizers, industrial minerals, construction materials, gemstones, and so forth. That's a classic description of what happens in mining, but it's useful to demonstrate the different objectives. This, just a minute, I'm going to turn this off. I put this in front of you because from a sustainability perspective, and again, thinking about this challenge to the industry, this is the kind of breadth of thinking that is required by the policymakers and quite frankly, the academics, and to think about the implications and the challenge that I'm trying to put before you. What this does is give a very, very high level and quite frankly, crude hierarchical representation of the systems, of the system that we have to think about. On the one hand, we need to ultimately, for results to test against sustainability success, we need to test against what the contribution is to the well-being of people. And that's not just individuals and families and households, it's the communities, it's the businesses and organizations, which include their employees and their investors and so forth. It includes governments, it includes others. This particular organization is because those tend to be the decision makers. This is a little bit dated, this chart, because particularly in the last decade, the role of Indigenous people in concrete decision making has increased dramatically. On the other side, we need to understand about what the implications of our activity is for the ecosystem if we are going to achieve success on that side. Now, this land, water, air, the hierarchy, the way I plotted it here, is a very crude way, and eco-science people will not want to go this way, but the advantage of doing this one is this is how government departments tend to be organized, so they understand that. And quite frankly, if I look at the organization of SMI, there's a certain reflection in how SMI is organized in terms of land, water, biota, and air. So that's useful. So that is all part of what I'm talking about. Mining itself is going to contribute to well-being, and they're going to contribute in a way that is going to be recorded in the economy. And if they choose, they can contribute to activities beside the mining activity in terms of things that are not in the recorded economy. And that's a whole game that we've just barely scratched the surface on, quite frankly. At the same time, there is stress imposed, physical, chemical, biological. I share that with you simply because of wanting to give you the breadth of what we're trying to deal with here. The mining companies. This also is something, and this is work that came originally out of MMSD way back in the early 2000s. There are global giants, there are seniors, intermediates, production juniors, exploration juniors, investment juniors. This profile is crude, but it's roughly, it appears to be correct as best as we can play with it. And there will be more, these companies, if you see the descriptive comments, I'm not going to go through these, but the reason for the reasons that I've laid this out on the right-hand side is that, again, the differences in these companies are profound in terms of their capacity to embrace change and ultimately improve performance related to sustainability. And if we don't respect their capacity and their interests and their needs, we are never going to get them being part of the solution. And they have to be a critical part of the solution. They have different behaviors. This is one way of looking at it. There are leading edge companies, and there is the vanguard, the rear guard, the corporate couch potatoes, the rear guard, and the hostile avoiders. The top three categories, which is probably the creme de la creme of mining companies, roughly is about 10%. And I think that's optimistic. It's probably, maybe half, if we're lucky, half of that, in terms of really willing to play a leadership role in achieving sustainability criteria. 60%, 70%, 80% of companies are passive, they are cautious, they may change on some instances, and there is an extreme element, as always, of companies that are active resistors. Those are the guys that if you go in their office, they'll throw you out of the office, but they exist. And in the mining industry, my experience has been relative to other industries. There may be more of these than in other industries, although I have no basis on which to say that other than personal experience. So we think about the companies, and we have to think differently about achieving sustainability, or this gap between society and the mining industry will continue. But the other interests that are in and around the mining industry, they also have a key role to play in either reducing or increasing the nature of the tension that lies between society and the mining industry. There are investors and shareholders, and interestingly today, there is a significant move of investors to put pressure on their companies that are their financial services companies to be more sensitive to environmental and social issues. So that is a change. Unfortunately, in my view, the financial services industry itself, which you'll see down in the third bullet, doesn't really understand the mining industry very well. And their way of dealing with their work, their understanding of time, their understanding of the significance of the ESG issue is, in fact, I think, relative to the sustainability equation and relative to what you understand there at SMI, I think it is shallow at the current time. A second group and we need to work with them in a way to change that. We need to work with the consultants who more and more are playing a critical role and may or may not. They have their attitudes also towards the issues that we want to achieve in the mining industry. They too influence the nature of the gap between the trust gap that lies between mining and sustainability. And I must tell you a little anecdote. As I sat on ICMM and listened to the CEOs be justifiably concerned about the lack of respect that they always got, I'll tell you, when you go to the big mining conferences, and since pandemic, we've not been able to have them except online, but if you go to the hallways of the big mining conferences and listen quietly to the small and intermediate companies, the subcontractors, the suppliers, the engineers, and so forth, and the lawyers, their attitude towards achieving sustainability, in my view, is just as much of an impediment to achieving success in what we're trying to do as is the attitude of many people actively employed by the mining industry itself. The lawyers, I will also put a finger on, because their caution rate now for fear of liability is driving, or not just for fear of liability, or to serve as boilerplate so that certain things be done. Witness what has happened recently in Australia. The lawyers are not helping on this equation either. So if we want to make change and bring mining closer to sustainability, they need educating in a different way also. You in SMI, moving on, are very aware of the role of the host communities. There is another side of this, because we all want to ensure that the host communities are taken care of. On the other hand, I would argue that we need to share decision-making, yes, but also share responsibilities. And if we share responsibility with host communities, they too have to be prepared to be held to account. And they're not very good at that either. They're no better than the companies are, I would argue. Indigenous people, I mentioned, there's an exploding role with the UNDRIP issue across the world and the acceptance of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the much broader acceptance, which is changing and is beginning to be entrenched in law, their role and responsibility. They have a sensitivity, a perspective that is incredibly important on this, and they can be change agent partners in what we want to do here. And I'm not sure that's always been recognized. I think people like to think that, but I think they should be explicitly recognized as change agent partners. Governance have a key role, which I'm not going to go into right now. Organized labor, where it is active, and there are many corners of the world where organized labor is suppressed, but where they are active, they have a key role to play. Civil society organizations right across the spectrum have a part to play in this. International organizations, the UN, the IFC, and the World Bank, etc. Industry and professional associations play a key role. I recall shortly after the tailings disasters in Brazil, I was contacted by people in Brazil who were appalled because the Mining Association in Brazil, which I knew at one time quite well, was simply saying, oh, all of that tailing stuff, that's just a problem of Vale and BHP. It's not the rest of the industry. The associations have a critical role to play in Australia there and in Canada here. I think they've played a much more positive role. I like to think that in any case. And academia. Of course, in SMI, there is a particular strong attitude towards the whole sustainability issue. It's the heart of your work. But what about the business school? What about engineering? What about chemistry? What about the rest of the community in the university? How do we get to them? Because oftentimes they are the people being commissioned by the industry to participate in mining activities, and their attitude and the way their attitude is seated inside the university is critical. You know, I was teaching at Queen's in Kingston a couple years ago, and the people in the department were encouraging me or saying to me how it was impossible for them to get people from international studies and geography and environmental studies across to build any relationship with. And I said, well, have you tried? And they said, we tried. In fact, our graduate students organized an evening seminar, and they couldn't get any response. And finally, one person showed up. Well, it turns out that they were, the angst about mining was so strong that they were afraid to come for fear of physically being set upon. I subsequently went over to the geography department and gave a set of lectures, and they were astonished. Not because of me, They were astonished because the issues that I was raising that the mining industry was struggling with are key issues within the mining industry. They had no idea. Why is this gap there on our university campuses? And it's across the world, I must tell you. I saw something put on by the London School of Economics, and same thing, it was reflected there. Then, of course, there are the consumers who are driving all of this, their desire to buy. And we're entering into a very different time with the consumers because people want to have their cake and eat it too. They want their computers. Here we are on Zoom. They want their iPhones, their smartphones, whatever. They want their cars. They want the things that mined materials contribute to, and they also want quiet, and they want a healthy environment, and they want all the other things that are in this sustainability equation. And yet they drive much of what's happening in society with our quite frankly wasteful consumerism. So there's a whole issue there that is pulling, and the mining industry for its part is simply saying, well, if the need is there, we'll provide it. It's up to society to decide the needs. But that's a bit of a cop-out in my view. But that's what's happening. So these moving parts, in fact, in my view, are all part of shaping the culture of mining, which in my sense right now is causing, yes, change to occur. It is causing change to occur, but the change in society is now moving more quickly, so the gap is actually widening. So improvements are happening in mining. There's no doubt about that. When you look at what's happened in the last 20 years, improvements are happening, but the change in society is growing larger, and this network of interests around the mining industry continues to maintain an overall culture that kind of allows mining to do some incremental change. But if I might say so, it's, what's the right word for it? It's grudgingly. It's grudgingly the changes that are happening. They aren't actively, and with some exceptions, I might add. We're talking about a lot of companies here. This is it's a generalization. And it is true. And I'm going to share with you what I call these 10 points of reflection. It's true that right now, the focus of mining decision-making, the long-term focus, the planning decision-making, the decision-making that internally wants to keep the project pipeline full in a way that works for the particular company. Because they're faced with massive fluctuations in the commodity cycle, they will plan to achieve cash flow neutrality at the bottom of the cycle. So they don't want to bottom out in the busts. They want to be able to survive through the busts. What that means, of course, is when it goes up above in the boom times, it's cash flow rich. And that's at the time when people look at it and say, this is not reasonable for society. And it is also true that by current law, executives are charged with protecting stakeholders' interests, and investment and strengthening investment is their first priority. That's what they get their kudos for. So in support of generating further investment, that's the primary incentive. That's how they're rewarded by their boards. And we need to look at that. They want continued maximizing earnings and company value. That's ultimately what the executives are getting their incentives from. Now, other things happen out there. And if it affects that, the boards will say, well, you got to take care of that too. If you don't want to muck around with the communities or have bad community engagement such that they stop a project. So that's worth us putting money onto them, because this is going to affect these other two priorities, these other two things that I raised. Now compare that incentive test to what I put on the first slide, which is posing the question, does your mining project or company contribute positively to human ecosystem well-being? Well, they're miles apart. Thus, the trust gap. People out there in society can feel this. They can't articulate it. Listen, both these points 4 and 5 are jargon. 3, 4, and 5, they're jargon. One is jargon from the mining world. One is jargon from the sustainability world, if you wish. And somewhere in the middle, we have to bring them so that other factors, when you look at other factors I mentioned, they're only considered if they affect the first priority, protecting the shareholders' investment or the value or whatever of the company. Now, the law that affects that is not mining law, it's business law. And it's only if that changes that the incentive structure is fundamentally going to change. And it's only if that begins to change that I think we're going to see a narrowing of the trust gap. Now, interestingly, and this has all happened since I left ICMM, let me move that out of the way. There are signals that change is underway on this front. I mentioned the rights of Indigenous people, and that's a big, big issue, a big, big question that's changed in many countries right now. The fact that governments have ended up with the costs of closure as large as they have been has led to some very deep thinking on the part of government, although we're not there yet. The recent tailings review certainly signals change to some extent on that front. The no harm policies of people and ecosystems and various policies to do with that are helpful. I think what I should have added on here is there's now the creation of cabinet positions which are charged with looking at the implications of government policy and action on future generations is a massive, massive breakthrough, which is going to change. When that microscope comes on to the mining industry, and it is on its way, people have been doing it, obviously. When that comes full focus on the mining industry, there's going to be some very tough questions asked. So it's a rocky road, and the current transition is dominated by some very significant barriers. And in particular, I feel that across the world, so much of what's going on right now is driven by reaction and fear, by a belief that there are good guys and bad guys, by a sense that there needs to be either a winner and a loser. And quite frankly, in the mining industry, that's how the mining industry always was. There are winners and losers, a gamble. Going back to the early gold rush, there were winners and losers. And that sense is still alive and strong. And yet, what do we learn about, for people that have really thought through decision-making, is that there's a profound need, if communities, Indigenous peoples, if other interests are going to play a key role, if the industry is going to actually avoid this or deal with the trust gap, there's a need for collaboration based on trust. How do you do that when they're just good guys and bad guys and winners and losers, and it's being driven by reaction and fear that you're going to lose your thing? So this at a time when we have more need than ever from mined materials. So finally, I think we have to turn our mind to change management. And that's in the corporate world, and in organizational behavior, it's much, much studied, but it's always studied at the microcosm. It's studied how it would apply to a corporation. And it's very insightful. It's fun to look at that literature and think more broadly, because we need to scale this up to think about the industry society domain, in this case, the mining industry society domain. And there's a lot of work to be done in that case, although there are some insights in the existing change management literature, which I think we can use as a very strong foundation. And to re-emphasize, I think that we need to pose the right question. And I would say that right question is, how can we work with all key interests to encourage growth and adaptation of the industry culture, which is a complex multi-industry interest community, in the context of the evolving culture of society? It's not simply, what do we have to figure out for the mining company to do differently, and please get on with it. So do what you do this because it's a better solution for it, and get on with it as fast as possible. That's not a great way. It's a very different question, this question, that I would argue should be posed and slowly responded to collaboratively with all interests in the industry. So Neville, back over to you. Those are the thoughts that I had in response to your question of the sustainability issue and challenge facing the industry.
Tony, thank you very, very much, and really appreciate the presentation. And I suppose as you were talking, I was just reflecting on our early conversations, and I suppose the interview you and I did around what we saw as being the big issues, and I could feel the beads of perspiration growing as you were talking from the interrogation. But Tony, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, and I'll open those up quickly now, and we'll just run through those. So those online, please feel free to put some questions into the question box. Really look forward to continuing the discussion. So I've got one here which really looks at, first of all, thank you so much for the thought-provoking lecture. The question is, what is the pathway to building societal trust in the industry? Scholars of trust and conflict note that if there's poor trust, then efforts to conciliate are often seen as manipulative or tokenistic. Won't efforts by the industry to build trust simply be seen as propaganda? So I suppose the question is, what is the pathway to building societal trust in the industry?
I think, interestingly, Pathway to Trust would be a brilliant book title. There's a good, I think it would. Listen, in a way, that's what I tried to answer in my whole lecture, what that pathway to trust is. And what I'm saying is that you're right. I'm saying you're right to the person who posed the question. It's very difficult to come up with a simple recipe that is then seen as manipulative, particularly if it's articulated by the industry, because it's self-serving. And that's why there are so often when I listen to folks in the industry, senior people talk about the importance of the industry to society and wish that more people would give the mining industry credit for all the important things they do, which is true. The problem is it's articulated from within the industry and it's very self-serving. And if it's very self-serving, it loses its effectiveness completely. So I don't think there's any way around this other than to enter into an assessment of the culture of the industry. That's the whole message which I've tried to share with you, which is different than simple recipes on technical issues. We have to engage with the community of mining, which is companies, a complex range of them, and a whole bunch of other industries, interests, engage with that community of mining in order to sensitize them to the goals, objectives, and values of sustainability. So they feel it from their heart, by the way. It's not a head issue, it's a heart issue. That's how I would respond to that now.
Annie, thank you. And I think it's just opened up a whole lot of other questions coming through. And I suppose that the other one you have tackled, and I'll just go through it maybe if you want to add anything else. And I think there's an easy answer to this question, but actually I think the correct answer is probably a lot deeper. In the mining company, who should/could initiate the culture change? Should it come from the top or could it come from the employees?
Do you know, that's a brilliant question because it has to be both. I must tell you that there's a wonderful literature on long-lasting companies. And if you look at that literature, you find that the charismatic chief executive officer is not the key ingredient. The key ingredient is a company that has values that are synchronized with society and are seen as being as synchronized with society and are consistent right across the board. So if you go to office in Brisbane or office in Vancouver, or office in New York or office in Paris, there's consistency. And in order to get that, you need commitment from the chief executive officer. You need to, for she or he to open that door for people. But the insights are going to have to come right across the company. And my experience is that, for example, if you did some scenarios work, the most brilliant people on scenarios work are not the senior people, but they are the most junior people, and they are the people that should be empowered to help contribute to that.
Absolutely. All right, the next one is, how do you overcome the adversarial method of settling differences between parties in society?
Well, this too, this is a big question. And whole sections of SMI are focused on answering that question. And I'm sure there are people over there that can give a bigger, better, stronger answer. But in reaction to that question, because in my view, I'll tell you where I really land on this is that in making decisions, you can make decisions where there are winners and losers, where one party is stronger than the other party. An alternative way of making decisions, which does not always work, is for people to find common ground and build a solution in the overlap, where their belief in what should be done and the other person's belief in what should be done are consistent. It's an idea of overlapping consensus, which is, again, if you check that in the literature, there's a big literature on it. To my way of thinking, that kind of decision-making leads to overcoming the problem that this questioner poses. And I've been now in at least a half a dozen instances where either as a participant or as a facilitator, where very acrimonious starting points have led to remarkable endpoints in terms of collaboration by being open and honest and finding that common ground. And there are people that are really good at this. And they're, quite frankly, in the mining industry, certainly in the leadership companies, the leading companies, there are some good people there too that are very, very good at that. But as an industry, when you talk about 25,000 people or 25,000 companies, it's not across the board. And if it's not across the board, the volume of the industry is going to pull the whole thing back or slow it down. And that's what's happening in my view.
So Tony, sort of the next question builds on that. And it's interesting how we seem to be finding these overlapping areas of consensus with everybody online. So this one, building on the answer about trust, there seems this will require a high degree of courage from the industry, with willingness to acknowledge difficulties and failures as a foundation of trust. What are your thoughts about courage and how to build it in the industry?
Boy, that's a wonderful question, because it is courage. That is a wonderful question. It does require courage. It requires more courage the first time that you admit that you don't know. Because when that happens, people will look at you and they will say, this guy's willing to admit. He's willing to admit that he doesn't have all the answers. Therefore, I can trust him, because nobody has all the answers. So it's a frighteningly difficult thing to do the first time or the first and second times. But once you realize that you can admit to not knowing, and quite frankly, there are lots of things about the mining industry we do not know. The idea of it being an experiment and we should treat it as that there's a lot to be said for that. to admit that you don't know, which of course, if you go back to what I mentioned earlier about academia, talk to the students that come out of an MBA program or that come out from an engineering program. They are taught to know the answer. That's the fundamental strength of a degree coming out of it. They're well educated, they know what to do, they know the answers. Humility, courage, and humility, I think they go together in a sense, in this sense that I'm talking about right now, because I think that it does take courage the first time, but it doesn't take courage after that, because you recognize the more that credit you give to others, it pours back to you. I don't know why.
Thanks, Tony. The next one actually comes from a student that's finishing off her PhD in a business school. And the question is, how does the mining industry engage the business schools in universities globally to examine some of these highly significant business tensions? And the impression is that this research is led by a few individuals, but not industry initiated in a strategic way.
I think you're absolutely right. And I 3 days ago was a colleague at Queen's University was leaving, and there was a big farewell party by Zoom. And I met on there a business professor who'd been a graduate of Queen's from 1981 in one of the universities, one of the big universities down in the States. And I said, "Are you doing anything with mining?" She said, "We don't talk to the mining industry." I don't, there at University of Queensland, there may be some overlap. I'm not sure how much interaction there is with the business school, but very little overlap between departments, and being in my experience in universities. And by the way, very sadly, all of what I'm talking about, if you look at decision-making and planning at the university level, and this is not unique to one university, this is right across the board, some of the, in my view, most acrimonious kinds of debates go on at universities. So if that's the example that students are learning from, what does that really mean on the longer term in terms of making the world a better place out there? Back to you now.
So Tony, I'm not going to comment on that, except to say that within SMI, we collaborate widely across the university and universities, and we do have good collaborations into the business school, which are growing stronger, particularly as we're developing a lot more professional development programs. And that, I think, is in response very much to the industry identifying the need in the space to be able to think very differently. So yeah, so it's pretty encouraging at the moment, and we can update you on that. I've got one here which really says, do you think there's any way, it is in any way possible to achieve an effective multi-stakeholder dialogue without a common perspective of what value is as a driver of strategic decision-making?
Yes, absolutely. And there are techniques to do this. And listen, that question is, there's a subtle thing I've got to pick up on. Read the part about values in that sentence.
So
again.
it's effective multi-stakeholder dialogue without a common perspective of what value is as a driver of strategic decision-making.
Right. So there are two things. There's a common perspective of values. There's a common value that could be held by multiple parties. And those are two very different things. And I'm not exactly sure what one wants to zero in on there. My experience is, and I'll give you, Nev, when I was there, I shared with some people the work I did on closure analysis, alternative closure analysis. We got a bunch of people in a room dealing with a very, very complex long-term closure issue. And there was indigenous people there, and environmentalists, and company people there, and government people there, and so forth. And we found a way to understand what is fundamentally important to them and capture that in a multi-attribute utility analysis. which allowed us, and in the explanation of how to do that, of course, we had to talk about what it means to have value. Did they bring the same values to the table? Absolutely not. There are very, very different values. But what we found then, and what I have seen again and again and again, is that there are certain fundamental values about life, about family, about community, about their children, and about food and so forth, that are quite universal. And when you realize that, then sometimes the guy across the table is maybe not such an ogre you think he is, or she is.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks, Tony. And I think it was having a look at value, maybe as opposed to values, but how do you assess people's value if you don't understand their values? So I think it's a really interesting question, and one just to unpack around the word value. All right, the next one is just a, I suppose, reflection on the cartoon that you put up on the early slide. And if you accept that the cartoon is suggesting that the process is broken, so if you accept this, how do you suggest on how the process could be fixed for community and societal benefit?
Goodness, that's another thing that SMI is working on as hard as anyone in the world. And I think that what the answer to that lies in generating a sense of respect for the parties with whom a mining company would want to interact with, and to reflect that respect with integrity and humility is what is needed to build a relationship. And it's about building a relationship. And every different community people is different. There isn't a textbook answer to this. It is a matter of entering into that conversation in a way that is marked by respect and humility. That's as much as I want to say about that, because again, it's a huge question. And there are techniques and so forth. Let me give you an example, though. If a company wants to interact with a community effectively, especially if it's an Indigenous community, and especially if they are serious about it being there, the chief executive officer or the chairman of the board need to go out to the community and spend time there. To send a consultant is catastrophic. To send junior staff out there is an insult. So it starts from the very beginning of the process. How important, I mean, the community people, it's their life. It's the most important thing they have. To the company, it might be one of 1 or 2 or 20 projects. But to the community, it's their life. And if they see that you don't have put the same importance into it as they do, then there's a gap to start with. So,
Tony, thank you very much. I've been fairly poor as the chair. I've just noticed we've used up our hour, so there are a couple of questions online still, and we will pick those up and respond to those if they're okay with that. Tony, we'll send those on to you. There are a couple that we didn't get to, and thank you so much for the conversation. It's really been interesting, and I think we could probably chat for another hour. So I think we should have another session where we can come back to you and on your reflections, on your point of reflection. So Tony, thank you so much for that, and really, really great to have you online and connecting with us again in this way. Just for everybody online, quickly, the next month's seminar falls in NAIDOC week. So Joni Parmenter from SMI Centre for Social Responsibility Mining and Florence Drummond, SMI's inaugural visiting Indigenous Fellow, will be presenting for us. Please keep an eye on the website for further details, and we'll send out the invitations. And just to everybody online, thank you very much for attending. We look forward to seeing you next month. And Tony, again, thank you very much.